Hi, so I'm Erin, like he said, and I wanted to start with a thank you because it always is the last slide that you're rushing through. I like to put it at the beginning, but I really appreciate being invited to the talk. It's kind of an honor to get to talk with your hero. As soon as we find Emmanuel, wherever he's at, I'm stalling for him, and to get to come to such a lovely place. I've never been. To everybody who's here today, who's, at least checking your email while listening to me talk, right? And to the team that made this project I'm specifically going to talk about happen because I couldn't have done it by myself. So, quick outline for the talk today. I'm going to talk about big science because I have been involved in it in the last 8 or so years, and it's really shaped a lot of my current career. And I think it's the thing that's next, if you will. So, collaborations, and then specifically the semantic priming across many languages has a case study for how big team science in linguistics can go, um, especially when you have no money, because we didn't when we started that project. And so, talking about the cultural and linguistic challenges, this is a great audience. I never get to talk about this stuff. Normally, I like just talking about, oh, look, priming. It's great. So, I want to talk about the kind of everything that went wrong, the technical and methodological hurdles that you might run into while running one of these studies, the ethics and governance questions. So, how does GDPR and other institutions' IRB board affect what we're doing? Managing people, this which has been 90% of your time doing, unsurprisingly, lots of email, and then authorship and thinking about how we structure collaborations so they're equally beneficial for all types of people. So that's what I'm gonna work through. I have a lot of really ridiculous stories that hopefully you'll find amusing. But I want to start with what is big team science? And I think this is a question that's slowly being answered, but hasn't totally been answered yet because everybody's interpretation of big is different. And so we were talking in the hallway about what's the difference between a mega study and a large study, and I'm like, I don't know anymore. Same idea with big team science. Right? So any type of collaboration is two or more people working together. And so people say big team science is something that is unusually large number of people because it's a way to hedge your bets and not pick a number. I thank you, Nicholas Cole. Um, and we have been really working in this area. And when I say we, I'm often talking about the Psychological Science Accelerator. I'm the current director with Savannah Lewis, but I've been working with the PSA for a long time. And so what Savannah and I did was you know what? Why don't we just look at the data, figure out what defines big team science? We ran a study on Scopus through Elsevier, where we looked at what was the 90th percentile. So if I look at all the papers ever published in their database in English, also been working with PSA, where a normal number of authors is 300. So 11 or more is still a lot of people to manage. And then just to kind of show you how the distribution of the data looks separated by area. So the health sciences and the life sciences kind of overlap. You can have papers in both of those areas. So this is a lot of the Human Genome Project, a lot of those big medical papers studying cancer. So they sort of figured out faster than us in that final box that more people means more resources, means we get more done. The physical sciences have a long history of big team science, starting with CERN, and they tend to actually have most papers with the largest number of authors. And the social sciences are oh, right, we're coming too. So we're finally getting up there as well, but we tend to have less numbers of authors. There's a history of this lone genius idea that if you weren't the sole author on a paper, then it dilutes your contribution for some reason. But we are getting better at that. And then you can see from the right panel that it's actually relatively unusual to have multiple institutions within a manuscript. Two is the bottom because two authors from two different places. But that is also slowly changing. So with the internet and kind of the way the world is now, it's easier to collaborate with people across borders. And then a picture of the number of publications. I just find this super fascinating. So this is this side is 2 to 10 authors. So the physical sciences, there's just increasing exponentially, probably because they don't have to deal with people, right? Studying people is hard. They call us the soft science. I'm like, have you talked to humans before, right? You have to ask them permission, first of all, right? And then you have to deal with it if they're having a bad day. So I don't think atoms have bad days where they just don't want to run your study correctly, right? But we're getting there, right? So we're the little purple dots in social science, which is where linguistics, psycholinguistics is classified. So we do see an increase in the number of collaborative papers, and then now slowly, really starting in the late 2020s due to COVID and people thinking about how to save their careers with no participants, you see this in the number of big publications as well. Okay. It looks like a small number, but it's actually in the several thousands. It's just in comparison to physics and health sciences, we're a little behind. But I do want to talk about two types, and unfortunately, the one I really want you to see is black. So blame Timo Roediger. But two types of big team science projects are individual one-off things. Mini labs is a great example. Those are all run by different people. The Open Science Collaboration, which was one of the first big replication projects in psychology. So people can run these sort of one-off projects, or you can have organizations. And it's actually becoming quite ridiculous at this point, but there are many minis. So every year in October, we run an online conference called BTS Con, if you're interested, where you can learn about all these different organizations and what we're doing. The Psych Science Accelerator is the only one without mini in its name, really. There's CRAPE, who does collaborative replications focused at the undergraduate level. Many babies, dogs, primates, birds, fishes, otters presented last year, and it was amazing because they have otters solving puzzle boxes to study human-animal cognition. It was super. I'd never seen them before this point. A new one called Mini Minis, where they're looking at across taxona. And a new self-promote, and I'll talk more about this at the end, is Mini Languages. So a couple of us who are interested in these big team studies in languages, especially after this project I'm going to talk about today, survived 2 moves across the country and several probably emotional breakdowns. We saw that this could work. So why not do it for linguistics? And that's really important for a couple slides from now. But then why this thing is a thing now? Why do we have this now? And that can really be tied to this increasing globalization in science, right? So the availability of the internet, these toolkits where we can talk to each other by Zoom or Slack, GitHub, all these tools and patterns of stuff we can use. And then the kind of push in different funding institutions for increased collaboration. Okay. Now that obviously changes with different administrations. I'm American, so that's become actually a problem because they want us to be very globalized, but they don't want us to send money anywhere outside of the States, which makes those two things kind of in conflict. But do big science, just do it here. So we're cheating. Don't tell RPO, all right? But we're gonna work on ways to globalize science, right? Because the study of humans is the study of humans, not the study of English-speaking Americans. There was a big crisis. Everyone's heard about this, but I like the way that Nelson et al. Put it a little better as our renaissance and thinking about methods and data policies and practices, right? So the questionable research practices, open science movement, all this stuff is happening at the same time. And I had just got out of graduate school when that BEM paper happened. So imagine I've spent 4 years learning, here are all the things that you do, and then suddenly everybody's like, just kidding. Oh, that's bad. So it's been really interesting to me to be working in especially methods and stats and thinking about how much that has changed since I've got out of school. All right. Then, of course, the Henrik's paper on weird science. People don't love this acronym anymore. It's sort of lost its favor, but it is sort of the first really strong paper to point out that most of science is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This is not a surprise to probably anybody in this room that most research is published in English, and it comes from the Americas and Western Europe. So how do we solve some of those problems? Well, big teams. And it is really successful. Okay? Depending on your metric of success, mine is that we make an impact, but there are entire subsections of journals dedicated to replication reports and publishing these kind of big collaborative efforts. So AMPS will publish these kind of bigger team science papers. There is increasing interest in these projects. The first couple times we did these grants, we got some really questionable reviews about why would we would want something where a lot of people are involved when two people could do it just fine. And we were like, have you? Okay. Mostly we were like, you haven't tried this yet, because if you had two people, you would lose your mind, right? Way too much work. But now we're seeing an increase and an uptick in the amount of money that people are willing to spend on these projects. So the PSA, for example, got a couple $1 million from the John Templeton Foundation to run several projects. We're working on finishing. And then, spoiler alert for the end, I also recently received some funding to do one of these large projects. So I will hit the goal of increasing collaboration, because if you're interested, I would love to have more collaborators involved. And then if you look at the things that your workplace cares about, this whole job, tenure, promotion, that stuff, they are usually in high impact journals, and they do tend to get lots of citations. Okay. So do mega studies, by the way. So either one of these kinds of papers tends to have a higher impact, just because it's either data that's available and or a large uh, cross language for our interests, but or cross cultural comparison. Okay. So since I'm super familiar with the PSA, I'll tell you mostly about that. But I know Mini Babies is also very successful in publishing. They have 10 or 12 papers now. But we have 10 or more papers with research or data involved in them. There's 3 in progress, one of which I needs a swift kick in the pants. But that's my job when I get back. And then 4 of them that are about to start. So if you're super interested in being involved in these, it's actually usually a fairly low lift. If you have data collection or translation abilities, we're always looking for translators. You can send me an email and I can direct you to where you can find out more. So that's my plug for the PSA. Wait, thinking about like what we're here to talk about today, um, what how does this tie back into this like idea of big data, right? So big team science really requires us to rethink our methodologies. They're sort of tied to often the lab. So I was interested in how many of Penny's studies were actually in person, or kind of thought about from a very Western centric perspective. So we really have to rethink how we run studies. Okay? And a paper that I did with, which I think would be considered a big team paper, I think there were 11 of us or more, with Agatha, and I won't butcher her last name, shows us that linguistics is still very heavily weird. And so we did a kind of a scoping review, very similar to the Hardwick papers of like who's doing open practices. And what we find is that we were looking at the author's affiliation. Where is that located in these kind of UN categories? Okay, what languages did they do, right? Or analyze, or investigate, or provide data for? And then the 2 bars are pre and post crisis. Okay. And what we see is that it's getting better across time, but it's still very heavily North America, which is the bottom of both of them, essentially. English in the big green, and then North America in the kind of teal color. And then also Northern and Western Europe. So still dominates most of the research that you see. And this is any author affiliation, not just first. It is worse in the first position. So how do we change that? Because there are tons of cool languages that don't get a lot of data. So where do we make that difference? So I'll talk about the SPAML. I thought I was going to get away with not talking about priming this year, but here we are. So I will happily talk about priming, but I think I've given half of this talk like 10 times at this point. So let me tell you about the project itself, and then we'll get into like what happened. Okay. So the scope was to do a big team science study on semantic priming, okay, across a bunch of languages. My dissertation was actually on priming, and I drifted away for a while, and now I've come back. Um, because there's really not a lot of data in this area. There's only one other that I can find big study, and that's Keith Hutchinson's semantic priming project, which is in English. Right? So like I know there's priming in Japanese, but how does that relate to English? Okay. And when you start to compare people's data, if they share it, there's too many holes. So Penny's talked about this as well, where comparing data sets that are available can often restrict the amount of words that you can have analyses for. Okay. So our goals: create this large-scale multilingual priming data set, test whether that priming works in different languages and cultures. I know during the review process, Mark Breisbar was like, "What do you do if you don't find priming?" I was like, cry? I was like, I don't know, because semantic priming is very consistent, right? We spend a lot of time manipulating. Is it automatic? Is it controlled? Can I move it up and move it down? But priming is like very consistent. Okay. It got a lot of bad press there for a while, but that was more of the social stuff. And then what can we tell? If we have the same word pairs for every language, what can we figure out about culture and language? Because they're very hard to disentangle. So some stats from the final project, and then I'll get into everything that went wrong. So we ended up with 30 languages with at least like one participant. So not all of those are currently fully formed yet. There were 19, I think, that had our minimum data collection requirements on them. But still, the other data is there for you to use. Okay, so here's the list. If it has a star next to it, it was part of our pre-registered plan. Okay. And so those definitely finished. And then we had some other ones that were kind of bonus finishes, thanks to a lot of folks um, especially in Italy, who were like, "We're getting this done. Here's 10, here's 100 more participants." And Hungary. So Balazs, can't say Balazs's last name, Essel. Don't tell him I pronounced it wrong. His lab has done many big team projects as well. So if you're interested in other folks doing social psych, their lab did one of the big moral trolley problem studies. But they helped us collect a lot of data. And Hungarian's not a well-covered language, so I was really excited to have it. We had 133 labs complete ethics documentation, and 126 actually collected data. And that's really normal for people to drop out. That's one thing I always tell folks when they start these projects, like, fully expect people to be excited until the rubber hits the road, my very American phrase here, where people will drop out once life happens and things get started. Okay. But we did get data in 41 geopolitical regions. That wording is on purpose, because depending on who you are and who you talk to, some places are not actually countries, right? So we always trying to be sensitive of those cultural variations and whether or not people believe how Taiwan should be described, Kosovo, Iran and Iraq. So I like to call it geopolitical region because that seems to be a little bit more acceptable than the word country. So here's a first hint at like things that can go wrong. The people involved. So we had 325 official authors. Do you want to know how long that takes to enter into journal system? I think you probably know. Yeah. Forever. Some journal systems actually don't allow you to enter more than 50 or so. So you have to like attach this side thing and then they fix their system. So AMPS did that to us. And then Nature Human Behavior, for all the money that Springer has the worst system. So every 3 or 4 authors you have to save or it'll crash. And it takes 2 whole minutes to save and reopen. And so if you do some math there, it's several hours and many beers. Okay. Takes a long time. We had 393 people who did complete at least one credit category. So they would have been authors if they had managed to not disappear on us. So it's another problem that we have is making sure that everyone gets the credit that they deserve. But students graduate and they run away. Okay? Or people don't pay attention to their email. So that's one of the things I'll talk about a little bit. Okay? For participants, we had 35,000 at least open the study link and like get through the practice trials. 31,000 made it through at least one study trial, but the really usable part is about 26 or 7,000 participants. For comparison, the Semantic Priming Project has like 800 participants. So they do have more words, but we have more languages. Okay. Not that it's a competition at all. Keith was like, I never want to do priming again. I was like, well, I guess I'm taking up the torch. And I think the analysis in the paper is on like 25 or something because of other restrictions, but this is the data that's available for people to use. Okay. So a ton of participants. I never would have thought this was imaginable leaving graduate school. It would have been studies of 50 and that would have been large. Right. So this is something that I find really amazing, and it allows us to really think about what is the size of the effect. Because one of the arguments in the priming literature is like, how big is it? Right, so 35 milliseconds earlier is sort of your normal size, but like now we can actually say this is probably what you should expect if you don't do anything. No manipulations, no, differences in intertrial interval, that kind of stuff. So why should this matter, right? Like why even do this sort of thing? So the amount of data available is sparse. So this is another big data problem. What can I learn from all of this? Right, priming is like one of the things that a lot of people use to investigate different cognitive processes, automatic versus controlled, and this process and that process. Uh, so having those data sets really allows us to think about thinking, right? And cross-linguistic data allows me to say, okay, this isn't just an English thing, right? This is the effect in general. This is a human cognition thing. So we can take apart what is cognitive processing versus what is cultural context. I think that would be really interesting, getting more at the base functionality. And I do, I have feelings about data sets. So I was really excited about the themes of the talks because written a couple papers on how data is now more readily available. The publication rates of these have skyrocketed, as Jan said at the beginning, and the amount of non-English data has also been skyrocketing. So this is a paper from a couple years ago in BRM where we talk about what's available, and we're actually working on part 2 right now. So soon you will have a data set of data sets that's updated. More on that at the end. Okay. And I show this slide, I think, every time because I have beagles and I'm just really attached to these pictures. I know y'all know what semantic priming is, but I'm attached to my beagle spoon picture. So if we think about priming in its like base definition, right? If I have cat, dog, I'm faster at dog because cat came first than if I have dog, spoon. Or the other way, sorry, spoon, dog. So we're comparing the same word. So we don't have like frequency effects or length effects or all these other problems because it's the same literal word. Now, you do have a problem with the first word. But if we think about the target word, it should have less of an interactive effect with these other variables, like what Penny talked about. And we're faster when they're related versus when they're not. And I could probably spend an entire month talking about similarity definitions and relationships. But let's just assume, pick your favorite relationship, and you should be faster because it's related. Now, these are my actual dogs. So I tried one time to get a cute picture of this, and they both were not having it. So instead, I'm spamming you with them sleeping because they're cute and we needed a quick mental break. Okay, so these are Bodhi and Utah. And that's probably what they're doing right now at home because it's 4 a.m. All right, so let's get into the problems. So I wanted to start with cultural and linguistic challenges because I think this is the best audience to talk about cross-cultural issues and language at the same time. Okay? I tell this to other people and they're like, I never would have thought about that. I'm like, that's because you don't study words. Okay? So the first one, I'll start with a simple one that affects so many different outputs. This is a traditional QWERTY keyboard most Americans use, most people who speak English use. And it's a layout that is very hard to get something different from actually in the US. Okay? But if we look at, I picked the Czech keyboard because of where we're at. They actually tend to use a QWERTZ keyboard. It's actually more common in German and parts of Europe. It's a little bit different. And so, if you're doing a priming study where the main goal is to get people to whack the keys, how do you pick the same keys across contexts? Right. So, if I want to keep their hands in a specific place on a keyboard, right, like they're here, what we had to do basically was in the sign up for the study, we had to be like, take a picture of your keyboard and send it to us, or like send us a link to the Wikipedia for your keyboard. Right? And that works pretty well, actually. Some of the trickier ones were in Great Britain. There's a slightly different bottom row from the QWERTY keyboard, but we were able to make it work, okay? So that you weren't too close together, because that can cause you issues if the response keys are like really close. However, Chinese, either simplified or traditional, of its main two branches, right? All different keyboards. It is not unusual to see, like, if you were to go to a coffee shop, everybody has a different layout. Or you can't assume that the keys that they're pressing have anything to do with what the keyboard's going to do. So a lot of keyboards have different layers that you can kind of turn on and off. If you're a multilingual person, you might have this sort of thing. So I have a couple of friends who are Russian who had to help me with the Russian version because I don't have those keys on my keyboard. So I had like, can you test this for me? Thanks. Where they just like press a couple keys and it switches to Cyrillic, and then they can switch back to Latin. Okay, so this, if you're super word nerd, the history of Chinese keyboards is super fascinating. There's a couple podcasts on it. There's a couple books on it, and how they solved the language problem. That's what they call it. Is a picture of one of their original ideas behind the keyboards, because you're talking about 2,000 plus characters. How do we translate that to typing? Unfortunately, what won the battle is that many folks type in pinyin, which is the Latinized kind of sound to spelling to get the character, which is like super unfortunate, because then you're sort of switching it back to the more majority world, right? But that was another one. So what we ended up doing for Chinese was the numbers on the top row, because that is actually fairly consistent. Cool. One problem I had anticipated, but with still like every lab, we had to ask, okay, what does your keyboard look like? What are your students going to be typing on? Then you rove into the problem of cultural practices and research. Okay, so there are cultural restrictions on what is and isn't appropriate to say and do to participants. That probably isn't too surprising. So we had to take the alcohol, like whiskey and cognac, which is actually one of our best word pairs. It works in every language. No idea if it works in Arabic, because we weren't allowed to show it to them. I'm sure it would. Um, and any kind of sexuality related words due to human body parts, or like I think lesbian was in the data set as well. We just weren't allowed to show them because it was culturally inappropriate. It was like, okay, cool, ditched. So they're in the items that we developed, because we had everything translated, but we weren't allowed to show them. And it was sort of, take this out or we can't participate. And we said, okay, cool, we'll take it out. Another example that I didn't write in here is a current study running that uses spring, summer, and fall, like the words autumn, like they're talking about the seasons, but in some cultures, those are also names. So they had to change the example items because they wanted to make sure it was seasons and not names. So some things about translation can also kind of get you tripped up. I know way too much about GDPR to not be living in Europe. But is fairly tricky in some countries. It is an EU regulation that every country interprets in their own magical way, depending on what feelings they're having that day. So while I think it's really cool because the US should be better at this, it's very hard to know if you're following it in the way that you want to, best practices. So convincing France, for example, that it was okay that the data was going to be stored in the US was tricky. And even though we had very little personal information in our study, whereas Italy was like, whatever, we don't care, right? So and for our Italian labs, they actually do a lot of cool stuff where they will review things at the country level, which makes life so much easier. But they were like, this is, we don't even need to review this. There's no danger here. I'm like, the danger of being bored to death. Because, like Penny described, this is a very boring task. Participants hate it. It's super mind numbing. But Italy is like, yeah, whatever. France was like, whoa, you're going to ask them about gender? Whoa. It's wild. I'm like, you guys are in the same like geographical region. Why can't you get along? So I always pick on Maya Becker, who's one of our big PSA folks, about how particular France is. We got away with it because that was the only real questionable question, so to speak. But you definitely cannot ask about like politics or religion without going through extra layers of review. So you have to keep in mind who's going to care about what you're asking in these studies. And then the extra added layer of our adaptation linguistically. Okay. God bless my Spanish team. I wanted to send them all cake because they got together and were like, we're going to do this. Because there's many different forms of Spanish, right? So we have a lot of Latin American labs in the PSA, which is wonderful. And then we have our traditional European Spanish. And they sat down and figured out how to make all the words work for all of the languages. Okay. My Portuguese folks could not agree. So our European Portuguese and our Brazilian Portuguese are 10 or 20% different, but it was very serious. So, which is fine. They're the experts in that language, but I just remember being like, but Spanish. So we had to adapt not only the words that we were using, but also the instructions to these slight cultural differences. But if you think about 133 labs, and if every lab wants to adapt theirs slightly differently, you're talking about one of the next problems, which is the technological hurdle of having to program that every single time in a different way. Okay. But that's what we do. Okay. But then you kind of worry too that it's not going to be comparable. Okay, this is probably now too small to read, but this happened to me last night. So I was sitting. I love Coke. Give me a Coke. Give me a Diet Coke, but you can't get Diet Coke in this country. So I was drinking my Coke Zero, and I was like, "Oh, look, it's one with actual check on it." Because I've been getting like ones with English on them. Okay, what does this word mean? And the word is, I don't know how to say this, but it's CHABR. Really? I think what Coke thought it meant was friend. So my partner saying with me, "Hey, what? This is check. What does this one mean?" And he goes, well, Reddit tells me that it's a friend you made in prison." And I was like, that doesn't feel culturally appropriate. Is that what Coke was going for? But it turns out it's probably now more of like a young person slang. And I am apparently not a young person anymore. So I'm not allowed to use it. But I was like, of course it's going to happen right the day before I want to talk about making sure you understand the cultural implications of what you're doing. So we try to be really sensitive to those differences. Right? Now, then the problem becomes, okay, we'll deal with all this different programming. How do we even plan stimuli? And this is a part of the project that I'm really proud of. So we have 1,000 word pairs that are the same as best we can match across languages. And that's Q-target related pairs. Okay. So that means that we then had to make 1,000 shuffled pairs. I'll talk about that problem in a minute. And then all the non-words. And so it was like, okay, how do I plan this to be culturally sensitive? Because there's a strong temptation to pick words that work in English and just translate them and assume that they're going to be the same. And so it was like, let's not do that as much as we can, because then that is me persisting this Americanization of research. So we were like, okay, let's just let the data tell us what to do. Okay. So in our field of big text, if you haven't used the Open Subtitles corpus, it's really great. It's a nice free resource. Most of the frequency data sets that we have that have been published across the last 10 years are from the open subtitles corpus. Gary Lupian's also been doing a bunch of really cool stuff with it. So it's a great, it also has the translations in a lot of the languages. So we took that, we downloaded all the languages that we had that were available, and we said, okay, we need nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, right? I jokingly tell my students these are the big four, because the rest of the words are just sort of glue that holds the sentence together. Well, that means I have to have a part of speech tagger in all those languages, right? Thankfully, UDPipe, which is the Universal Dependencies Groups package that takes all these different tree banks that are available and kind of standardizes them and formats them, uses that data. So while there are cool things in Python, this is the one time that R actually wins the battle here, where you can part a speech tag, limitize, and dependency parse languages. So if you're familiar with Spacey, that's the Python version, they actually have more languages. And so it's really way too tiny, but it's just showing you that it will tag the words for you. So we use that. Unfortunately, some of those data sets are really, really large. So thankfully, my university has the computational power. So it's another layer of tech that you got to deal with. If you're going to work with big data corpora, you got to have computers that can process such data. Okay. So using word frequency, we took the top 10,000 words from each language. So we wanted to have high frequency words so that people would know them, because obviously lexical decision doesn't mean anything if people don't know what the word is. Usually the answer is wrong anyway. And so we took these high frequency words, taking some fast text models from Van Peridon and Thompson. We calculated the top 5 most related words to that word. Right? So if you have brother, the biggest one next is sister, but then family, mother, father. So you get like a list of candidates here. And then from that, via translation, kind of merge them all back together. Right? And said, okay, how many times do pairs come up in more than one language? Right? So you're letting the data tell you what words you should use. These are more universal. I use this loosely. The answer is for 50,000 pairs, right? So 10,000 words with 5,000 candidates. I'm sorry, 5 candidates, multiply. You end up with like 1.2 million because the translation isn't perfect, right? And the average overlap of like this pair is in English and this pair is in Japanese and Korean, etc., is only 3%, which was unfortunate. But it does range all the way up to 70%. And so the histogram here is the percent of overlap across our languages that we were interested in for these 50,000 pairs. So we started from the top and worked our way down. So we used the ones that were the most overlapping in most of the languages, excluding repeats, like trying to limit the number of proper names. So the 2 big ones are Sherlock and Watson and Romeo and Juliet. So we like try to keep those references now. Those work really well if you're interested in good words for priming. The best pair is heroin, cocaine across languages. But Romeo and Juliet's really close. Okay? So there's like about 40 word pairs that work in every language. So that's kind of fun. And so we picked from that. So this is like a data-driven process as much as I could to kind of limit. So there are word pairs that make no sense in English and do not work very well, like pyramid and structure. Students are like, whatever, I don't get this one at all, but it works well in other languages. So we can start also to see where cultural differences might lie. Excuse me. But even when best laid plans. Okay. So we have this pre-registration. I started a document at the beginning that was like everything that went sideways. And by the time we were done, it was 20 pages, single-spaced, of all these different things that had happened. So even when you have these good models, like these fast text models and all the right data with very large amounts of text, that methodology doesn't always work. Okay, so expect some things to just not work. So for example, we took the related pairs, we made the unrelated pairs. This is very common, shuffling them. Okay. And so we wanted to shuffle them until they had a low similarity value. And Mark, who was a reviewer on this paper, made me define what I meant by low, which is annoying because we picked 0.15, thinking like that's pretty low for cosine similarity between two vectors in these fast text models. Because English, surprisingly, the word one is used so frequently in different contexts that its cosine similarity is pretty much 0.3 with everything. So that was the only word in the English language that caused a problem. Okay, fine. It'll be fine. No, it wasn't fine. So Korean, right? We were able to get it down, like we increased the level to 0.2 to make our unrelated pairs. And we did Korean first because we got some money for it. And then the other ones happened. So you'll notice a kind of a theme here about Japanese, Serbian, simplified Chinese, and traditional Chinese, we just gave up and shuffled. And I think like when the average cosine between words is 0.8, you know something weird's going on. That was the Japanese one. And I don't know if that's capturing visual similarity or what exactly was, because we made these, we took these models from a published paper, and so it should map the rest, but they don't. Their cosines are much higher than if you calculate all-way cosines in other languages. So there's something about these, and a lot of them are not Latin based, right? So maybe there's something there. But then we also have Russian, Greek, a couple more. I've lost it. That are also not Latin based. So it's not just a Latin problem. But interestingly, we just wrote in our paper like, we tried, sorry. Because pre-registration is not a straitjacket. It's a here's our best plans and we'll see what happens. Okay? Now, the people labor part, right? Translators. Oh my gosh, I love our translators so much because I would never have gotten it right? Especially all the different forms of Spanish. I probably would have gotten that part probably wrong. Understanding the cultural implications of some of the wording in Russian was really tricky. So you just need a really good set of translators. And so what they helped us do was map that meaning, that Q target meaning. So, well, this one's a noun. Do you want this one to also be a noun? I'm like, probably. Does it make more sense as a noun to you? Like, yes, then do it. So there was a lot of discussions, meaning way too many emails, about making sure that it had the same intent as what we gave them the English translation, and then we gave them what Google told us the translation was, so people had a place to start, and then they edited for us, just to make it a little easier on the translators. There's some languages they barely changed anything. Some languages where it was just like, I'm just going to toss this and do it myself. Like, cool. Dealing with dialect. So different areas have different dialect, different word frequencies, right, and word choice. And then non-words. So non-words are tricky. You've ever worked with them? So this is actually the part I hate the most because you're trying to find words that are pronounceable. You don't want them to be too fake because then the task is too easy. And so it gets then you get expectancy effects and a lot of other stuff that like Neely has published about. So any words that are pronounceable but not too fake, and those were our instructions. And they were like, what do you mean by too fake? I was like, well, all consonants is pretty fake in every language. So not that. So our folks did a really good job of helping us come up with words that were fake. Okay? And so we generated our initial non-words using a Wuggy-like algorithm because Wuggy no longer works. And it's a pity that Emmanuel is not here for me to like look at him and be like, you're great, but Wuggy doesn't work anymore. Just because it's, 15-year-old software, and software doesn't always stay up. So if you need a Wuggy-like algorithm, it is in our package. You can use it. Please do, because I spent a lot of time writing it. But it was essentially, we repurposed what they did in that. If you aren't familiar, what it does is it looks at the transition probabilities between mostly bigrams, not always, kind of like word breaks, syllable-esque breaks, and then picks a similar syllable or bigram that is equally related as in likelihood to be have the word before it and the one after it. Um, Actually, probably more complicated than that to explain, but if you read that paper, we recreated that in R. Okay? But then translators could change stuff because they were, what the language suggests that people do and what people actually do are slightly different, probably. Because, like, well, this is valid in your language. Like, nobody ever does that. I'm like, okay, great, change it. All right, and then I want to say it was traditional Chinese. We pulled those from a recent mega paper where they had created fake characters because that's a totally different problem. Right? So a lot of linguistic style hurdles. Now what about the technical background? So what happens when you try to run the study? So if this is all like designing the study and getting to this point, what happens now? Okay, I've got it programmed. What are we going to do? Okay. First big question, power. So if you're going to submit a registered report, they want to know about power. And I can't just go in and be like, well, everybody does 30 because central limit theorem or something or another, so 30. And they're like, no, not allowed. And, power and sample size planning is usually driven by the design of the study. Is it a between subjects test, within subjects t-test, right? Our choice of hypothesis test. Well, for us, this is effectively a single sample t-test once you start to do the math and get the priming score for each item. And we have 1,000 items, so almost anything ends up being significant, right? So that feels like cheating, right? And that doesn't tell me anything about sample size because the sample size is based on the items, not the people. So and that could certainly make up an effect size for the study, but it still doesn't tell me anything about the number of people per item. So we were kind of stuck here. So I made something up, okay, based on accuracy and parameter estimations. This is mostly, if you've ever read anything by Ken Kelly, he writes a lot of these papers on like thinking about how do we actually measure the thing we're trying to measure as opposed to powering the effect size. It's very Bayesian-y without being Bayesian. So if you aren't ready to give up frequentist statistics, this is a good like halfway point. Okay? And it really forces you to think about like, what is it I'm actually trying to measure and when do I think it's well measured? Okay, so they describe these as sufficiently narrow confidence intervals, which effectively just means like, at what point do I decide that this is a well measured thing? Okay. And then there's a bunch of math involved, but we're just like, okay, well, how well measured is a lexical decision time? Okay. So what we did was we defined a minimum acceptable size by using the semantic priming project and the English lexicon project, looking at what are normal lexical decision times, what are the known values for priming. They're actually kind of vary all over the place. And so we did a bunch of simulations and figured out that CHIP-D participants is about the point where most of the items, their standard error stops moving around, does like hopping up and down. Okay. Then we figured out a stopping rule. So where can I get to a point where this word has so many items I'm not learning anything new about it? Sometimes qualitative people call this coverage. About 320 participants because there is so much variability in priming. I'm sorry, the stopping rule was based on standard error. The maximum was 320. We'd be here I'd still be doing this study. The stopping rule is based on standard error. Right? So confidence intervals, math, standard error. So once it hit this point, we would stop. And so it allows you to do adaptive testing, where as you're going through the study, you can basically be like, those words are fine. I don't need any more information about them. Let's get into these weird words now. And just some citations for accuracy and parameter estimation. But then because we kind of made this up as we went, we wrote a paper about how you can power by the item. So really important for this audience. Hopefully coming soon to behavior research methods. Fingers crossed that the other editor likes it, because obviously I am the other editor and I can't look at my own paper because it's apparently frowned upon. But hopefully soon. But it's available as a preprint to look at, like how we figured out the right sizes for things. Now, all right. So I'm going to use this adaptive procedure. They're going to get at least 50 participants. That's the minimum, maximum 320, and there's a stopping point somewhere in the middle. Now, if I tried to give participants 1,000 Q target pairs matched with the unrelated pairs, matched with the non-words for expectancies, I probably would have had a right? It's a really boring task. As you said, we did 800 trials. It's about 20 minutes of mind-numbing torture. I have done the study many times testing it. It's very boring. Right? So participant attention is a very finite resource that you have to think about how long can it be. Many of the platforms where you can collect data will not let you go over 30 minutes. Um, and interestingly, even though we tested this in every language to kind of get a good feel for the median, some languages are slower than others. And I think that might be because of the people that are on these different platforms, right? So the younger folks go faster, unsurprisingly. Okay. Uh, and so in a priming study, we have to control for relatedness. So we had about 75 word pairs, unrelated, 75 related, and realness. So to make sure that the lexical decision was also 50-50, they couldn't just continue to guess words. Okay, so over 800 trials, you're only interested in the pairings of 75 of them. So it feels like a lot of data. So if you're really fascinated with non-words, please use the data because there are so many pieces that you can grab. Okay. So that's why I think this is a really cool project because even though I boiled it down to these 2 million trials I was interested in, there's still data for all these other components that you could look at. And then the problem of are all items created equally? I laughed when Penny was like, well, we used to do this like high words versus low words. And then now it's like, oh, right, we can use multi-level models and do all of the words. And then you realize that items are not created equally, right? So in Southern Missouri, I could not use hero sandwich, not gyro, like with a G, but hero. It's a large sandwich, but people in the Southern U.S. Never heard of it, right? So there are all these like different pieces that kind of make some items better than others. Better meaning they work, right? And so we pretty much can't treat them equally. So that's where adaptive testing comes in. Okay? So you can take this larger pool of data and show them a smaller pool of data. And adaptive procedures help you decide like these words need more, these words need less. So if you ever look at the data, some of them have 50 and then they stopped. Some of them have like 400 because it wouldn't quit, so to speak. And so it puts more data in the areas where you are more uncertain. And it's very Bayesian. Like, I don't have a good feeling of what the actual estimate is for this. So let's put more data over there so I can get a better feeling. Okay? And so after each participant, really once an hour, but you could do this after every participant. We did it. It was an algorithm that ran once an hour. The sample size for each stimulus was calculated. We had to make sure that compare if they got it right, wrong, didn't answer it, that kind of thing. And once it achieved the minimum sample size, we would calculate the standard error. And then we would keep sampling that item until it either reached the goal standard error or the max. So every item would give this sort of like probability of being selected. And once you hit the goal standard error or the max, your probability of being selected basically went to 0. Not perfectly to 0 because you don't want your entire study to be weird words, but close to 0. Okay. So it would sample non-words, real words at these different rates. And so every participant actually gets their own unique set of different words. And it ran once an hour because the data got so large that we couldn't run it any more faster than that. Okay. To kind of give you an idea of the background here, like how this ran. So we've got Lab.js was the software that we used to run the study. It's really great at gathering reaction time data. It would read in the stimuli that was currently the current set, if you will. It wrote to a database. And then once every hour or so, I would run this little, not literally me clicking the button, but like telling the computer, hey, run this thing. It would read on all the stimuli and then randomly pick and write out which ones should be next. Okay. With the raw data, we also created a Shiny app for researchers to know how many data points they collected. Because this all has to sit on one server, or it can't know what data's been collected. And then at some point, it got so large that we had to do like monthly backups. So I rewrote these algorithms several times. And if you're interested in adaptive sampling, I can give you a lot of tips. kind of lessons learned the hard way. But you end up having to put together this kind of system. This isn't Qualtrics, right? Right? It's like say everybody take this one study. You're creating a system that works interchangeably based on what you have. Now, even when I'm running that same study across all these labs, it's the same study. They're working from the same basic gist. There's just a lot of complexity when you scale to different labs. Right? So I wanted to call this slide "You Can't Have My Tom," but everyone needs a Tom Heyman. So Tom Heyman does the same sorts of work and also statistics. He was the inspiration for a lot of the item level priming effects. And the really funny story about this is like, I'm gonna make Tom the best reviewer. He's gonna love this. And then somebody who worked with him sent him a message like, oh, hey, Erin's running this thing. You'd be interested. So he sends me an email and I'm like, I would love to have you on the team, but you should probably turn down that review invitation. And he got the invitation 2 days later. So he ended up being on the team, which was a lifesaver for me because you just need a person that can help sanity check stuff. Right. So the story behind this is we were sitting in a meeting one day talking about something or another, and I was like, well, accuracy, blah, 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 blah. He's like, well, this, he said something, and I was like, wait, how are you calculating accuracy? And so we ended up having this like hour-and-a-half discussion about how accuracy should be calculated, which feels like one of the most simplistic things, right? Total correct over total seen. He's like, no, it should be total answered. I'm like, no, it should be total seen. He's like, no. So we actually ended up doing both in the paper. But having that person that can have those moments where you're like, check you on what you're doing is really handy. So I'm jokingly, everybody needs a Tom. Right? Last 2 hurdles, not as long. All right, so ethics boards, what we did was we created templates for each of our labs to use so that they could kind of get this basic idea of like what we were doing and the stimuli and all that kind of stuff. Lessons learned include data management plans. This is not super common in the States yet. It's slowly changing, but it's really common in the EU to have a data management plan. Where's the data going to be stored? How long is it going to be stored there? What are you going to do if a participant asks to be removed? Right. So questions like that. It will reduce the amount of time that you spend answering emails. And what we found with PSA studies is that ethics tends to fall in 3 categories. No, we have to have our own. So I have to apply and get permission to test my own participants. Oh, this other university has it? Great. We can rely on that one. Okay. The middle is very common in countries like Italy that have this sort of global procedure, and the US. And then surprisingly, a lot of them are like, we don't have ethics boards. I'm like, at all? Like, you don't have to ask permission at all? Like, nah. I'm like, can you get someone at your university who's not you to write me an email that says that? So we have proof that everyone had ethics or doesn't have a requirement. And for some places, it's like, you're not testing health information, you're not taking blood, you're not testing animals, we don't care. Cool. So expecting these differences in ethics boards can help you prepare. Okay. But then some more theoretical, like big picture questions. Who owns the data? Okay. So I'm running this, I'm like the lead PI on the study, right? I don't really own the data because other people were running it. And they don't feel like they own all of the data. So there's sort of this embedded question of like, who is the data? Okay. So what we did was we just said, we're going to share it openly. Everybody owns it. Okay. The only thing you can't do is publish the paper that we're writing for the register report. But you're on that paper. So, just don't run the analyses. If you do, great. Let me just have them. So we did open sharing via Zenodo. That allowed us to have a DOI so that everyone can get recognition for which data set they were part of. And that is in addition to the paper itself. So you kind of got 2 DOIs out of it. But it's a really tricky question. And then lots of people, like if they're having their undergraduates, they want to run an analysis and present it at a conference. I was like, go nuts. Here's your data set, right? So we tried to be very open that the data was everybody's. But it can get quite like contentious. A different project did not have this feeling, and it got kind of, there was yelling. Big boss. So then the whole idea of power dynamics, right? I know we're not using global south anymore, but I forgot what the new term is because minority world also feels very like weird to me. So certain areas of the world, it's harder to run participants, right? You don't have these like ready-made intro to psych, fresh-faced freshmen, right? They'll have less institutional support, less money, translations on added value on top. So one thing you want to try to keep in mind is the power dynamics of what you're doing. Okay. All right. And so another less fun thing to deal with is the conversation of who gets to stay. So there are certain countries that cannot publish together. The people will leave. So what we've taken to doing is letting people know up front. We don't restrict who's involved in the study, and we will show you who's involved with the study. And if that ever becomes a conflict of interest for you, just let us know. Okay? So we've had Chinese teams pull out when Taiwan teams were involved. And then Iran and Iraq are especially not friends with each other. I think everybody knows this, but it does mean that you have to have this conversation. Like, which one of you is going to stay? And then are those local labs benefiting? So sometimes this is called parachute science, where you come in, you take the data, and you run away. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that as well. Is everyone getting something out of it? All right, a couple more. So the admin teams, whoops, too excited. So one thing we do is we have these admin teams that have a more than a few folks on them so that you don't get kind of like groupthink going on where you have your Tom Haven who goes, but accuracy is not calculated that way, right? You have somebody who has to make the decisions. There has to, even in a democratic group, there has to be somebody who has the final say, okay? Or you never get anything done. Okay? You have your project manager who herds the cats. Okay? This is a person that keeps you on track, keeps going, deals with problems, lets you know, hey, here's what's going on. Your tech or methodology lead is the person who can help implement. Now, for me, I did both PI and that. And that's the tech lead is what I do in a lot of the other PSA studies. Our ethics coordinator who herds different cats, basically like, hey, this ethics thing isn't in English. Can you tell me where it points to the fact that it is our study? And then our translation coordinator, so that's supposedly herds the cats in Czech, maybe. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I was like, okay, I need to be culturally aware here. Our translation coordinator was amazing. She got people to get stuff done. Okay? And then depending on your level of skill, because not every PI is really good at multi-level analyses, at scaling up data sets, having somebody who can help you scale up the methods, right? So controlling for the fact that there are different languages embedded in different countries with different items. And so that structure has worked really well for the PSA because it allows people to have a defined role and specific goals. Right? So the translation coordinator and the ethics coordinator, after a certain point, are kind of done. But then the data analysis person takes over. Write everything down. Whoop, I got excited. Okay. So even if it's like a stupid thing, like, hey, Korean didn't quite work today, they want to know that later, especially if you're doing register reports. So writing everything down becomes critically important. Okay. And tracking contributions in this manageable way. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about both of these things, and then we'll kind of skip to the end because I got excited. And I knew I made too many slides last night, but that's how this goes, right? What we did for folks, because otherwise you just get constant questions. And you're trying to run the study and not answer emails. So how many participants do I have? And when are we going to be done? And what are we doing? So we created two systems. One was a Shiny app that it's kind of small to see, but you could see how many data points we had in each language. And you could click on the language that you were looking for and find your participants' information. So the lab could look for themselves. Here's how many participants I've had. Here's my goal. Here's where the language is at. And then below this, actually, we had a kind of like a clock that would tell you how close the language was to being done. And a lot of people said they really enjoyed like figuring out like, okay, if we have 10 more participants, are we going to flip over from 98% to 100%? I think Massimo in Italy was like, he was like watching it. I was like, it updates every hour, so give it a break on refreshing. So this is like lab communication. Are we? There we go. Okay. Where was that? All right, couple more slides. So when you are managing people, you need to keep track of what they're doing so that they get the appropriate credit. What does it say? Oh, it's the test. Okay. It's all fake. So what we did to manage people, I'll try to push on here, is this is Canvas. It's an open source LMS. Some of people use Canvas for like work stuff, but there's Brightspace and Moodle and Blackboard. And so while researchers don't like being told they get grades, this has actually worked really well for us, where we kind of have a grade book and they can see what contributions they've gotten. This is a little small, but like I can say, okay, you've gotten credit for investigation. So once people got over the whole, I'm a teacher, I don't need to be graded effect, it helps because they can see what we think we know about them and fix things as we go. Okay. A quick self-promote is that because of all these things, I have spent the last 2 years writing software to actually do this. So Staple is project management software that is designed for researchers and researcher problems, including credit categories. So if you're interested in that, I can tell you more about it later. Okay. But to kind of wrap up, because there's a little bit on authorship, but we've kind of covered all those different points. You want people to get credit for what they did. Okay. And so you should very clearly state how to get credit and what that means for researchers. So that was those two slides. But I figured you probably also wanted to know how this priming thing actually turned out if you haven't seen this before. So there's a paper. It also is in press at Nature Human Behavior as soon as they figure out how to finish formatting it correctly, because every time I think they're going to push the button, they're like, oh, right, this one sentence, you got to change it. And I'm like, just do it, whatever, I don't care, push the button, right? So that's about to come out. We have a package for the data, and I actually wrote a R package to help you get the data so that you can download it a bit easier. Okay? But all that work, all those people, what happened? Priming, wildly consistent. Never in 100 years would I have expected this to be the result of the study. So these are the medians and the box plots of the general range. So these the bullets over here, Sherlock Watson, heroin, cocaine, Romeo and Juliet. Over here, pyramid structure. Wildly consistent. And given that these are different writing systems and different cultures, unexpected result. But there is some variability between languages. So if you stack them from smallest amount of priming to largest, what I used to joke about was why am I studying English? Because it has the smallest effects in priming. So I really should have been studying Japanese or Serbian, maybe Italian. Wouldn't have found all those null results potentially before. Some of that's probably due to the way we selected the words, so there are less words that work because I'm not biasing it towards English. But there is enough variability that it was considered significant. Okay? And so we're kind of playing around right now with why. Why are there differences? Because if you look at the distributions of the data, they're very close. Okay. All right, so some final thoughts. Big team science, really hard, but very rewarding. Okay? Linguistics is right for this. This is a good place that we should be, right? Covering the different languages, the different researchers, and the different participants that one can have involved. Okay? And there are a lot of challenges, but they're not really problems. They're the features of doing this at scale. So I thought it was going to be interesting. Hopefully you enjoyed seeing what happens behind the scenes of one of these big projects. Okay. And there are also places to learn new things. So the PSA has done a bunch of papers on like how we do things so that other people can hopefully learn from our mistakes. Okay. Now, if you're interested, I have 3 different opportunities. I'm like the salesman of many big teams right now. So there is a group of folks called Many Languages where we are running linguistic projects. And there's actually one in the pipeline that's very similar to what Penny talked about this morning called Many Affordances, inspired by Penny's BOI. Not me, thankfully, but a friend of mine. There's a new project called Many Languages One Network. This is the research funding that I just recently received. I survived Elon and got funding. But this time I have money. So we're going to continue this project to fill out all of those languages and collect other data like concreteness, familiarity, AOA. And then there's a new group, mostly run by Mahmoud El Sarif and Steve Verheyen, who I'm sure I'm mispronouncing because it's Dutch, called Mini Norms, which is a group of people who are interested in all of these data sets and big team groups. So if any of that sounds fascinating, I will connect you to the right folks. So just shoot me an email. Thank you for putting up with the sirens.